We're joined this morning by Jim Bueermann and Barry Friedman. Jim, sitting right here, is a retired police chief and the current president of the Police Foundation, which is a national nonprofit dedicated to supporting and improving policing policy. Barry Friedman is a leading authority on constitutional law at New York University, and they are both here together because they have a shared interest in how we can build safer, stronger communities. And I'm very excited to have them here for this conversation. Jim, I'm going to start with you. The top policing story in the news over the past week was this interesting new report that came out on body cameras. A lot of people, I'm one of them, have been excited about the promise of body cameras and the promise of transparency in criminal justice moving forward. But this study suggested that actually had no effect whatsoever on reducing use of force, use of lethal force. I'm wondering what you think of where body cameras stand right now.
Well, it's a really interesting concept. I think there's a lot of things going on with body cameras. One of the very first things is that we should never forget to ask ourselves the question, why do we need body cameras in the first place? You know, there is a disconnect between many of our communities and the police, and that's why we think we need these things. As it relates to the study that just came out, and there are many studies, and the studies appear now to be kind of all over the board. So you've got the Washington, D.C. study that said there's really no effect. You've got a Cambridge study that says that they can, in fact, increase assaults on police officers. And then you have a bunch of other studies that say that they reduce complaints against officers and use of force by the police. I think we're at a point for a variety of reasons in this country where we've gone past the tipping point about cameras. I think that we are going to see body cameras be as ubiquitous on police officers' uniforms as their handcuffs and their radios and their sidearm. I think we're just there. The narrative and the conversations in communities these days is if you don't have cameras, it's not about are they effective or not, but why don't you have cameras? And there is an expectation about them. There are multiple metrics that go into the decision about are cameras good or are they bad. Not all of them relate to complaints against officers and use of force. My whole career, so I started in policing in the late 70s, I carried a little micro tape recorder. And the whole purpose of that, and this was the discussion and narrative in my organization, was you had it for emergencies if you were doing a dying declaration or something that you needed to record. But also, you officers kept these things as a matter of self-defense. That I would record things, so if you said later on that I said something that was inappropriate to you, I could pull out my tape and say, listen to it. I did not actually say that. And I have personally had multiple experiences, and it is very frequent with teenagers, for instance, where their parents come in to pick them up, and then they come back to the front counter to complain because they say, I just talked to my kid, and he said you guys were rude. If you pull out the tape recorder and you listen to the kid, popping off to the cops, then it helps the parents understand better what's going on. So I think there are these other things about accountability and all that. I will say that just fundamentally, if you ask yourselves a question about your life, when you were a kid, did you behave better when you thought your teacher was watching, when the minister was watching, when your parents were watching? As an adult, did you behave better when you thought your supervisor was watching? So I think while there's still a great deal of mystery about the mechanisms involved in body cameras and whether they work or don't work and what's happening there, I think just common sense will tell you that on some level, we behave better if we think that we're being watched by somebody with some authority over us, especially from an employee standpoint. Whether they work or don't work in these studies, you have to understand there are methodological questions about how all of these studies were done. And I want to applaud them. I want to really applaud the DC police for doing this and the mayor's office, because before they engaged in a very large-scale expenditure of taxpayer money, they set up an evaluation process. Whether that was a good one or not, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. Somebody else can judge that. But just the fact that they wanted to know whether that expenditure of taxpayer funds actually worked or didn't, they should get big props for that, because we don't see that often. We see people saying, well, you're my neighboring police chief, we like each other, you say something works, so that's good enough for me, and I go out and spend a lot of taxpayer dollars to do that. And sometimes we're spending people's money on things that clearly do not work. So But I don't think they're going away, fundamentally. I think at the end of the day, just to kind of summarize that, I think they're here, and we're going to have to spend a lot more time and effort trying to understand the value of them, how people perceive them, and the unintended consequences of using that kind of technology and where they can be adverse. The technology we see today is very clunky compared to what we're going to see probably soon and sometime in the future, and I think you're going to see all kinds of integration with other kinds of surveillance technologies that will relate to what the body cameras can see now.
You know, Barry, you and I were casually chatting about body cameras yesterday, and you made an observation that I think is very challenging to civil libertarians in the audience who are maybe excited about body cameras because of the possibilities for transparency. You said, on the other hand...
Yeah, so there is an on the other hand, and I think it's important to focus on what that other hand is. Before I get to the other hand, I just want to say it would be a mistake to read the Washington, D.C. study and think there's no value to body cameras. It was a great study in many ways, but there are some methodological issues. Among other things, officers in the same precinct, some of them had cameras, some didn't, so there were bleed-over effects. We just don't know yet. It's going to take a while to know. But even though I favor the accountability aspects of it, and I think many officers favor the accountability aspects of it because they know, as Jim was saying, they've got some cover in terms of what they're doing, here's what the future's going to look like, which is that officers wearing body cameras are also going to be wearing Google Glass or something like that. They're going to use facial recognition software so that the people that they are seeing are then going to be threat scored, and so it's not, it is not science fiction to think that people will be glowing green and red in their Google Glass as they're walking down the street, and that's a challenging future, but it is one that I know that folks out there are thinking about and working on.
Let's talk about another really important piece of research. And Barry, I'm going to ask you about this one. There was a paper that made kind of a big splash a few months ago. This paper is called Police Officer on the Front Line or a Soldier. It was in the American Economic Review. It's about police militarization, which is an issue that we work on a lot at the Charles Koch Institute. And I want to get these numbers correct. These academics determined that a 10% increase in military gear will lead to a decrease of 5.9 crimes per every 100,000 people. Basically, they found that if you militarize the police a little bit more, you're going to get more public safety. What are your thoughts on the study?
So it's an important study, and it points to, I think, two of the themes that I'm going to keep coming back to here. One of them about cost-benefit analysis of policing practices, and the other about what, at the policing project that I run, we call democratic policing or front-end accountability. Let's do those in order. So it's important to understand what a small number of crimes prevented that was. So the baseline was 2,500 crimes per 100,000 people, and then they found that 5.9 crimes are avoided. So it was a tiny effect, and they acknowledge that it's a tiny effect. But what's fascinating when you read the study is, they reach that conclusion, and they come to the end, and they say, let's do a cost-benefit analysis. It costs this much for the military gear. The estimates suggest that, this is the value of the crimes prevented, so the militarization is worth it. Nowhere in that study, and this is just classic throughout all of the literature, you can look through all of the literature about policing practices and whether they make sense or not, and what you never find anybody talking about is the social costs, the costs to society of militarizing. So just to give you one example, when you hand military equipment out to police departments, does it increase the number of SWAT raids? Is there more damage to property? Does it cause a loss of community trust? None of that gets measured, and it wouldn't take very much of any of that to swamp your 5.9 crimes that get avoided. The other point, which I'll just flag now, because I think we're going to talk more about it, is at the Policing Project, we talk a lot about the absence of front-end accountability or democratic policing, which is to say, when you think about government, and there are lots of folks who live here in Washington, D.C. and think about government all the time, you know how it goes, which is that there are rules and practices that get adopted by administrative agencies or legislative bodies. Those rules and practices are public, and importantly, there's some opportunity for public input. People in this town are, they have their finger on the button of what the public thinks about things. And we have a back-end system of accountability. Things do go wrong, and when they go wrong, we have courts or we have congressional hearings, but most of the focus is on the front end. In policing, it is exactly the opposite. So there is very little front-end accountability in policing. There's very little public input into what policing practices should be. And instead, when we talk about accountability out in the public forum around policing, it's always the back end. It's body cameras, which if you think about it, are just a way of trying to figure out after the fact what happened. It's civilian review boards, it's inspector generals, it's court-appointed monitors. And so, you know, when you think about militarization, the issue that many people don't focus on is, at the very least, if all of this military equipment is going to go to local police departments, there ought to be a mechanism to get the local community to reach decisions about whether they want the equipment or not.
Well, I could imagine somebody walking in and saying, okay, that's a given. There isn't a lot of front-end accountability and front-end analysis. There's an obvious reason for that. Police officers have a very unique role in government. They're not like tax or environmental regulators. They are people who make instantaneous, split-second decisions that deal with life and death. That is not the kind of thing that can be analyzed on the front end. You can't be giving people, I mean, you can give some, but you can't give too many real checklists for that kind of thing. What's the response to that argument?
Yes, you can. So if you think about other people that make split-second decisions, can anybody think of any? Medical personnel in emergency rooms, military, they do have checklists. There's a whole movement to have checklists in those situations. In fact, I'll tell you a story that in my book, Unwarranted, Policing Without Permission, I tell this poignant story of a colleague of mine whose daughter fell through a plate glass window. And they rushed her to the emergency room, and she was bleeding profusely. And he stood there, and, you know, she needed a transfusion. But instead, 2 medical personnel stood on either side of the bed, and they read her name and her date of birth and her blood type. And then, while he's, you know, going out of his mind, thinking get a transfusion started, they switched sides of the bed, and they did it again. Why? Because many more people die of getting transfused with the wrong kind of blood when you don't take the time to check it out, as opposed to losing blood. And the same thing in the military. There are protocols for all of these situations that military officers, soldiers run into. And so the idea that you can't have rules for policing, we do have rules for policing. Police departments have elaborate manuals and protocols for the things that they do. The truth is they're just not public. I mean, some departments have them out on the web, which makes me wonder when other departments say they can't do it, because, you know, many departments have them right out there. And the one thing that's critically missing is that we don't have input into those protocols and those practices and rules, so that we're being policed in ways that we're comfortable with, in a way that, you know, I heard the senator, builds trust in communities, so the communities feel like they're getting the kind of policing they want.
Jim, I want you to weigh in because you've been a police officer. How realistic is this kind of front-end accountability?
Well, it is realistic. I'm fond of talking about the co-production of public safety. You know, a healthy, well-functioning police department is one that seeks people's input and commentary before they enact and develop policy. I've testified before both the House and the Senate about this issue, saying that if we're going to give surplus military equipment to the police, there ought to be a requirement before they receive it that there be some kind of a public hearing where the public gets to weigh in, and that the legislative body at the local level has an opportunity to weigh in on this. The way this system was set up is that it completely circumvented the public and the locally elected officials. So the police agencies could go right to the military, get the equipment, and show up with it. And that, in fact, happened in my hometown, where they acquired an MRAP, one of these big armored vehicles, a mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicle, without any input from the community, without even the knowledge of the city council, because that's how the system works. So that doesn't make any sense to me. If you can't make your case for the acquisition of military surplus equipment to the public and to your local elected officials, chief or sheriff, you should not be doing this. You know, that's in my former business, this is called a clue. You know, when you can't achieve that through an articulation of the rationale, then you should pay attention to that message. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do it. And I think we have to think about it. Now, having said that, I will also tell you that there are multiple instances where it's very clear that either an armored vehicle or long rifles were critical to the police being able to save somebody or to protect themselves. So we've got to be clear that sometimes it's not the equipment we're talking about, it's the context and the use of the equipment that's problematic. And we just saw this in Las Vegas. The police officers that were on the scene had no ability to try to suppress the fire of the guy that was up in the Mandalay Bay Hotel. Had they had long rifles with them, they probably could have done that. It may have been dangerous to other occupants of the surrounding hotel rooms, but there's no way they're shooting at that guy to get him to stop shooting innocent people with shotguns and handguns. Similarly, in Florida and Orlando, when the Orlando Police Department had to go into the building and get the guy that had killed all these people, they had to breach the wall with an armored vehicle. It was the only way they could get through the wall to get him. So there are clearly instances where these pieces of equipment were helpful. Where we truly get ourselves in trouble is when we just put them out nilly-willy without any real thought. And it's the front-end accountability you're talking about.
And I just want to piggyback on something Jim said, because it's an important lesson. So, you know, we've gotten into a terrible place around policing in society where everything's a fight about pro-cop, anti-cop. You know, are you pro-safety? Or I guess there's a contingent of us that are anti-safety. But that's all ridiculous if you stop and think about it. We all want to be safe. And one of the ironies about the debate about things like front-end accountability around militarization is departments find time and again that when they don't check in with the public, and then the public learns about it, there's this backlash, and the ability to use the equipment is removed, though the equipment might have had a real value. And so we're much better off having these discussions on the front end, developing policies about how the equipment's going to be used, making sure that there's training so that the folks that use the equipment know how to use it properly and only use it in circumstances when it's called for, and then we're in a much better place.
Completely.
Jim, do you want to say something?
No, just completely.
I want to keep pursuing this idea about militarization. There was a really important report issued by the Obama administration, report on 21st century policing, and one of the key ideas to come out of it was that we have to start thinking of police officers, they have to take a position as guardians rather than as warriors. This was the language that was used from the report. So, Jim, I want to ask you, that sounds fine in the abstract. What does that actually mean? And can you give me a tangible example of an officer acting as a guardian, not a warrior?
So it has lots of implications. First of all, what we mean by that in the warrior, right, is obviously, you know, when you have to engage an active shooter or there's a bank robbery in progress, that's kind of the warrior mindset that you've got to try to stop that from happening, much like the Las Vegas incident I just talked about. As
you said, it's necessary sometimes.
Sometimes you have to do it until people stop shooting other people. That's going to be a necessary requirement of somebody in government to do that. The guardian perspective, though, is one that's really a protective orientation to the community. And in my view, that warrior mentality is actually a subset of the guardian. So you want people who can act as protectors of the community, who episodically act as a warrior and then go right back when the need for that skill set is over with. You put that back in your toolbox and then you go back to being the guardian and protecting people. And that reflects the reality of street cops. You literally can be helping an elderly person across a sidewalk and 30 seconds later responding to an active shooter situation and at the beginning of your shift. And at the end of your shift, you're back trying to help some kid find his way out of drug abuse, or you're taking a burglary report. I mean, it is a very diverse experience every shift for police officers, and being able to go from one orientation to another and rapidly, and putting that warrior orientation back where it needs to be can be challenging. So the U.S. Department of Justice, the COPS office many years ago, had an initiative that I wish they would dust off and re-implement, which was called Recruiting in the Spirit of Service. So broadly, there's recruiting in the spirit of service, or adventure is the other term. And you can generally tell this by looking at a police agency's website. If the website shows a bunch of cops with helicopters, machine guns, SWAT officers, and motorcycles, they've probably got the adventure orientation. Much like the military has the adage of be all you can be, and they show somebody, you know, SEAL teams, whatever, in the swamps, and they come out of the swamps and pointing the guns at the enemy. You know, there's probably a fraction of a percent of all of the people in the military that actually do that kind of adventure stuff, but that's how they used to recruit. And policing agencies can do that too. Agencies whose website are full of pictures of police officers in non-enforcement postures, playing basketball with kids, talking to community members, trying to solve problems, gives you a great insight into the organizational values and whether they lean toward the warrior mindset or the guardian mindset. I think if you ask anybody, and you know, if you ask police officers what they want from the cops in their own city, they're going to describe something maybe in different terms that looks much more like a guardian than a warrior, but they always want the guardian to be able to act like the warrior when they need it. Right?
I have an impression, I don't know if I'm right about this, my impression is that we are hiring a lot of warriors to be guardians, meaning that we're going to the military, going to the Army, the Marines, and that's where a lot of the recruiting happens. My question is that correct? Do we do a lot of that kind of hiring?
You know, well, there is a lot of hiring of that. So from a police chief's perspective, many of you may be employers yourself. It's not fun to hire the wrong people because there's downstream implications for employee behavior, and you know, you spend a lot of your time dealing with a very small percentage of your workforce that just can't behave. When you hire people that have come out of the military, you get people that are generally much more mature than the average candidate. Yeah. They're very disciplined. They're used to a paramilitary or structure. So there's a lot of reasons that they're easier employees to get on board. There has been almost no research about whether bringing people from a war environment into a domestic democratic policing model is good or bad. I think, you know, this country has very strong sentiments that are supportive of veterans. This is true in policing. Police chiefs and sheriffs all over the country feel very strongly about veterans and want to give them an opportunity to employ. They tend to be good employees. But what we don't know is whether they can disconnect from the war experiences they've had and then re-engage in an entirely different format where most of the time they are never going to act in that model. We just don't know enough about it. I will tell you that the majority of people that get hired in policing are not from the military. They're people that are in the communities and do that. But all it takes is one or two police officers that have an issue or misbehave to change the discussion in your community entirely, as if every officer acts in that particular way.
Barry, you mentioned your book, Unwarranted, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that come out of the book. The book is very critical of the American judiciary, and I can quote it. I mean, you literally write, "I think the judiciary should be ashamed. Confronted with situations in which the police have done the most inappropriate and untoward things, too many judges simply cannot bring themselves to cry foul." So I want you to tell us why you think there is this problem in the judiciary, and I also want you to take on an argument that my guess is most well, maybe not most, but many judges and many people in law enforcement would make if they came into the room right now. They would say, look, we can start crying foul a lot more often, and then police officers are going to get a lot more timid, and they're not going to police as aggressively, and you're going to see more crime in communities.
So I did write that. It's true. It was painful for me to write that. It was not an easy sentence, and I went over it many times. I've been a constitutional lawyer for 3 decades now. Many of my best friends are judges. And I, shortly after I write that, let judges off the hook for a reason that I want to explain to you and turn our attention back to front-end accountability and democratic policing. But I want to stand by what I said, which is that I think judges are very, very afraid to weigh in when policing is at issue. If you think about most of the cases they get, they're exclusionary rule cases, and so what's happening is they're being asked to throw evidence out that indicates that somebody's clearly guilty. One of the problems that judges have is that they always see situations where the cops came up with the goods, and they don't see all the situations where there are searches and stops that far outweigh the number of times when somebody gets caught, and so they're being asked to approve practices when it looks like they work terrifically well. And I think that there are many situations in which judges should have just stood up and said, this is not acceptable behavior. That being said, I say 2 things about judges and the very problem that you identified, which is it is very, very difficult to calibrate the remedies for police misconduct. And I use misconduct in a very broad way. I mean, I want to echo some of the sentiments from my good friend Jim here. One of the things I've learned in all the work that we do all around the country and the time that I've spent with police officials and in cop cars is I could never be a cop. I'm constitutionally unable to do what is a very, very, very demanding and difficult job. And things go wrong. They go wrong all the time. And if you think about, anything, raising kids, I mean, any situation where you have to encourage and yet discipline, it's very, very hard to get that line right. And so if you are insufficiently apt to discipline, then you're going to get a lot of misconduct. If you discipline too quickly, you are going to get depolicing. Officers are going to say, why should I run into that house where somebody's yelling help? Because I could be wrong about my right to run in there, and then I'm going to have to pay for it. So I acknowledge the problem. The answer in part is to ask judges to do better, but in truth, the answer is to move to a system of front-end accountability, to have clear rules and clear procedures to which officers are trained so that they know what is expected of them and that we've all bought into the things that they are going to do. And that's what we're not doing. And that chapter is situated where it is in the book, right before the chapter that says, here's what we need to do, which is that we need to get the public involved in deciding what's appropriate for officers to do and not do, so that we've all bought in. And some of that might involve telling police or police officials that they can't do things that they want. Though, one of the things I say to folks is it can't ever be an answer from the police to say, well, we didn't tell people because they wouldn't like it and they wouldn't let us do it. I mean, this is a democracy. On the other hand, I firmly believe, and I can cite you many examples where if you go out to the public first and if you consult, you develop clear sets of rules, sensible sets of rules about policing, how policing should happen. And militarization is actually an excellent example of this, which is that after Ferguson, a lot of communities did have conversations about what they wanted to happen with military equipment in their departments. And we have a federal system and a lot of diversity in this country, and many of those communities reached very different conclusions. Some of them decided to keep the equipment, some to give it back, some to require that there be public notice of what equipment was held, some that there be votes from the city council before equipment was acquired. But what matters is that that kind of a process builds trust. Then when the department has the equipment, everybody's agreed that it's equipment that they should have, and at that point, you've ended the conversation in a healthy place.
I want to ask you, Jim, about something that was in Barry's response there. He talked about this idea of the police officer who may see something happening at a house but decides, why should I run in there? You don't want that problem. Some people are labeling that phenomenon the Ferguson effect and saying that it's happening more and more often. And their argument is that you've seen a really extraordinary 20-year decline in crime throughout the country. There has been a modest increase over the last 2 years. That increase, interestingly, seems to be centered in places like Baltimore and Chicago, where there have been some notorious police-civilian interactions. And their argument is, well, this is the Ferguson effect. The police officers are worried that they're going to be attacked and pilloried by the community if they do even something slightly wrong in these emergency situations. So they just decide not to police as much. Do you think that's happening?
So this is an area of interest of ours. If I can find somebody to fund it, I want to do a really large study about this, because my own belief is that there's multiple causes for what might be called depolicing. I am really adverse to using that phrase, the Ferguson effect or whatever, because I think it's much more complicated than that. In my career, I have never once, ever seen police officers, I know of no instance where somebody's life was threatened and the cops did not go try to help them because of this. What I have seen and witnessed this in my own organization was police officers had to ask themselves, why should I do this discretionary, proactive traffic stop or pedestrian stop? There's a minor traffic violation, or maybe the guy looks a little odd right now, and my hunch is that maybe he's up to something, when the organization, not the community, when the organization is going to do something to me. So there was a period in my own department's career, history, early in my career, where the police chief was at war with the police union and was actively trying to find ways to get the union president and vice president prosecuted for doing their job. And so it was really an issue of organizational injustice. It had nothing to do with the community. This was entirely a workforce issue where the street cops hated the guy that was running the place and didn't trust him, and so they weren't going to give him ammunition to do something to him. But even in spite of that, I know of multiple instances where officers put themselves at risk and did things that might have even caused them to be disciplined as they were trying to save somebody, even during that really tough time. So I think that there are reasons for that. In California, we passed, which is where I'm from, we passed a thing called Proposition 47, which dramatically reduces the criminal sanction for a lot of crimes that used to be felonies, they're misdemeanors, and because of another attendant action by the state legislature to realign the prison population into the county jails, there's literally no room to put people that you arrest for low-grade crimes like drug possession of heroin or methamphetamine or cocaine now, or even shoplifting or auto theft or things. So what we are seeing in the numbers, we've just done an analysis on this, is that in conjunction with the passage of Prop 47, there is a dramatic drop-off of arrests by officers. We haven't necessarily seen an increase in crime, but what we have seen is police officers, and we've heard anecdotally from a lot of them, that if nothing is going to happen to these people, they will not be held accountable. And there are lots of stories of people being arrested 30, 40, 75 times for shoplifting or auto burglary, and nothing happens to them. Cops say, why should I waste my time doing this? Because while it takes me 2 or 3 hours to book this guy and deal with the paperwork, I could be out here looking for some serious criminals that are hurting people. So you see kind of a redistribution of the proactive attitudes in some environments. And I think that there are other reasons that this may happen too. One of them would be linked up to that thing. But I just have to tell you that just at no level does it sync up with my experience that police officers, because they're unhappy about the community holding them accountable, or even with federal consent decrees, where the police officers say, I am not going to go save that hostage, that child that's at risk, that person that's being shot at, because I feel bad about my job. There are other things they might do. I do believe that's probably true, as I said, but they get in the business to save people, and it is completely at conflict with their own internal value system to, at that moment, somebody's life is at risk, not to do it because they're upset that people are critical of them. It's much more nuanced than this and problematic. But I think this whole thing underscores the importance of talking about the impact of our conversations, our laws, our federal intervention on human beings called police officers who have decided it's an entirely voluntary occupation. Nobody drafts you to be a cop. But these people have decided that they're going to engage in an occupation where they will knowingly risk their lives for perfect strangers. And I just think we should be very careful about demonizing those people and thinking about the issues that cause them to behave differently, which is not to say, and I don't want anybody to misinterpret what I just said, we should not hold them accountable and their agencies for their behaviors and their strategies.
Barry, I want to ask a question. I'm going to title the question, A Tale of Two Cities. And the two cities are New York and Chicago. Crime just keeps dropping in New York. I mean, they will do things like, pull back on stop and frisk, and everybody says, oh, now things are really going to get bad. No, it just keeps dropping. On the other hand, you have Chicago. You can fly from New York to Chicago in less than 3 hours. Their cities are very close to each other, big, prominent American cities. In Chicago, things just keep getting worse. And I think I saw that these recent FBI crime statistics said that there's national increase, 22% of the national increase is a result of just Chicago alone, where only 3% of the American population lives. What is the difference between these two cities? What is New York doing well? What is Chicago not doing well? And can you transfer the New York model to Chicago?
So we're actually trying.
Yeah.
So the Policing Project has worked in both cities. We're doing a lot of work right now in Chicago. I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, though I'm going to try to tackle some pieces of it. I'm going to start by saying that partly we don't know because there's a shocking lack of sufficient social science around policing. I've been an academic for 30 years. I've worked in very many fields. And as I came to policing over the last decade, I was constantly surprised at how inadequate the funding was to answer the questions that need to be answered. And there is a lot of social science, but often it's misdirected in terms of the wrong questions. And I don't know if we're going to get into any of the work that actually the foundation, the Charles Koch Foundation Institute, are doing, but they've certainly funded us and others to do some great social science. And I think it's important because to solve problems, we need to know things, and we have to figure out how to know them, and it's complicated. And it's harder to know them around policing than many other things. I mean, the entire world's devoted to doing randomized controlled trials, but that's really hard to do around policing. It's hard to say we're going to intervene in one neighborhood and not in another neighborhood, because even though we think that the intervention will save lives, just to find out whether it works or not, because people in the neighborhood without the intervention are justifiably going to wonder why they didn't have it. What New York has done is a couple of really important things. The first thing that they've done is they've invested very, very heavily in neighborhood policing, which is to say that they have changed the entire staffing and deployment model for officers. So for a long time in this country, what we would do is, you probably think about police as having a beat. We all have that idealized image of the officer walking their beat, knowing their neighborhood. But in fact, what they do is they race around town in cars responding to dispatch, and they can barely keep up with the number of calls for service. And New York said, we're going to commit to keeping the officers in their sectors, in their beats, and we're going to staff up additionally so that we've got some officers who can race around and answer calls for service. And we're going to try to engage the community and get to know the community and develop relationships with the community and listen to the community as a crime-fighting tool. You often hear community engagement offered up as one way of policing and this sort of proactive, aggressive policing as another, as though they're at war with one another. But what New York decided was that they weren't, that they were both good policing tactics. The other thing that New York has done is that, and they're very proud, folks at the NYPD, that the number of stop and frisks have dropped by over 90%. The crime does, as Vikrant says, keep dropping. And it's because they're targeting their efforts. They are trying to find the bad guys. So increasingly, what we think we know, and again, remember the caveat at the beginning there about we're not sure that we know anything, but what we think we know is that a lot of violent crime can be traced to a relatively small number of people. And New York is making an effort to focus in that direction rather than going with the broad sort of stop everything that moves approach that has been prevalent in many cities. Chicago's not alone among them, but certainly has been very prevalent in Chicago.
Jim, Barry talked about the idealized view of the police officer walking his beat. You actually just did a report, which we supported, about foot patrols. Can you talk a bit about the report and what it concluded?
Sure. We looked at the foot patrol experience in 5 different cities of various sizes and concluded that there are lots of benefits from foot patrol. There's still a lot we don't know about that. There's kind of a void of science in some of this area. And in each of these 5 communities, they did foot patrol very differently. And that's an important notion because the staffing levels, in this country there are almost 18,000 police departments. And police departments are as diverse and as varied as the audience that's here today. So what may work in one city that's very small geographically, it's very concentrated, has a lot of buildings that go up as opposed to the urban sprawl, may not work in another place. So in the town that I worked, it's almost 40 square miles, and our staffing levels were such that on duty frequently we would have 1 sergeant and 4 officers. And you're not going to do foot patrol in an environment like that because you can never get there. You never get ahead of the call load. You never get to places you needed to be. Yeah. In some places, I have a good friend who's a chief in a department that's about the same size population-wise, but it's 9 square miles and it's very concentrated. And the staffing levels are entirely different. In his community of 90,000 versus mine of 80,000, we got down to 70 cops, and he has 460. So there's a huge difference and a huge variance in how we think about this across the United States. What I think is really important, though, is the mechanism that is at play when we talk about foot patrol. Many years ago, somebody invented the car. And prior to the invention of the car, cops walked around and they had a chance to talk to people. They'd stop by and see how things were going, et cetera. So there was a lot of interpersonal contact. You got to know the people, they got to know you as a police officer. You got to witness things. Then we invented the car, and then we put cops in the cars, and then we gave them radios, and pretty soon we created this little metal cocoon that they go zipping by at anywhere from 20 to 70 miles an hour, depending on where you are, and it isolates officers from the community. So what we think is going on in all of this, the mechanism that's important is the ability to stop, to slow down, and actually speak with people and say, how are you doing? What's going on? My first name is Jim, what is your name? And get to a place that's beyond, quite frankly, the badge and the uniform, or beyond the fact that you're a crime victim or something, and get to know each other. And I think, to be honest with you, I don't think this is nuclear science. I think this is how human beings do well with each other. When we get to know each other, we find that there's probably a lot more in common that we have. If Barry and I are very different, and we get to know each other, we find that we have more in common than we're different. And in that commonality finds a place that we can work, and whether it's compromises, or we discover mutual interests, and we discover that, much like a potluck, we're both bringing something different to the table, right? And I think this is what happens at the micro level of policing, but if you add all that up, you get kind of an aggregate effect in a community and a police department, which is this co-production of public safety I talked about. If you're a store owner, and I'm walking the beat, or I get out of my car and I go up and I talk to you, you're going to tell me things about what goes on in that immediate area that I didn't know about, because you're there all the time. It's your business and you see this. Together, we're going to figure out a strategy. And it'll be really informal, but we're going to figure out something. I may give you my cell phone number. Today it is impossible, I think, to find a police officer that doesn't have a smartphone. I mean, it's just, everybody's got a smartphone. And in my agency, we issued those to people, our officers, and it was mandated that they gave the phone number to people. So whether I wanted to or not, I'm going to give you my cell phone number, because it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the department. And you can call me and say, Jim, you know that guy we were talking about? He is back and he is up to something, right? Or, hey, could you swing by? I just don't feel comfortable right now. I got to run the cash out to the bank, and I just feel funny about it. So you develop this very interpersonal connection, and this, again, the process of co-producing your personal safety, but it also informs me about what's going on. Cops know a lot about crime, but we also, they get very isolated. They deal with huge amounts of tabular data. They have a little box in their police cars called an MDC, their little computer, and the whole world is kind of coming out of that box now, And the problem is that there are people connected to that thing, and there are people with real problems and feelings and perspectives on things. And back to my example with you, you might be unhappy with us. And if I develop a relationship, you'll probably tell me, hey, you know what, Jim, sometimes you're kind of a schmuck, or, why do you guys never come by here? Or why do I always see you at the donut shop? What the heck is that all about, I don't know, I like donuts. There are just opportunities to equalize this interaction and the transaction, but you're not doing that if you're stuck in a car all the time and you're zipping around the place. And this is why this comment that Barry just made about having enough cops to give them enough time so they develop these relationships is fundamentally important. It's a bad place to be when you have so few that all they're doing is going call to call, because they're almost never going to develop those relationships. And that's, I think, the importance of the Foot Patrol study, and why, because in those 5 sites, it was remarkably different, but the mechanism at play always came down to the same thing, where I got to know you.
You said something in there that I want to follow up on, because I bet you don't mean it without reservation. You seem to suggest that the rise of smartphones has been good for police-community relationships. Surely it's more complicated than that.
It is. I mean, it's a love-hate thing. I mean, I think all of us out here both love and hate our smartphones. I bet there isn't a person out here that doesn't have a smartphone. One of the things that has happened with the rise of the internet, smartphones, and social media is that space and time is almost meaningless now. So when the gentleman died in police custody in New York, he was arrested for selling cigarettes.
Eric Garner.
And there was somebody filming that. The next day, there were protests in Los Angeles. 2,500 miles just evaporated like that, because we now consume images almost in real time. We used to have to wait for the news outlets to have a photographer out there to take the picture, to write the story, to read the paper. Now, every one of us is an e-reporter, right? And some of the networks actually encourage this. So we capture things that are happening right now. We put them out onto our sites. They go viral. And before the officers that are involved in those things can even tell their bosses what happened, it's gone viral and things are out there. That is both good and bad. It is a huge challenge to policing, but I do believe it has pushed policing into a place to where they have to face these accountability issues, the front-end accountability that Barry was talking about, in ways that they might not have done had that not happened. The best time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. The best time to build accountability issues and relationships with people is before you have a problem. We used to call this investing in the bank of community trust in my agency, because we knew we were going to make a withdrawal. And just like your bank account, if you need money and you have been making investments in that, don't be surprised when there's nothing there and the ATM card comes spitting back out of the machine at you and says, sorry, no
Barry,
money.
did you want to say something?
I mean, amen, brother. But this reminded me of something I saw in a precinct in New York, which is we were getting ready to go on a ride along, and there was a sign in back that said, "Come back safely," and somebody had written underneath it, "And don't end up on YouTube." So there's
That's the reality.
Yeah.
Barry, I want to ask you about another buzzword. We talked about the Ferguson effect. Another very prominent phrase in policing is broken windows. And the question just is whether or not broken windows works. You know, in New York City, broken windows, the rise of broken windows coincided with a drop in crime and a drop in incarceration. I think that's notable. Could you, for those who may not know, just describe what broken windows policing is and talk about whether or not you think it's effective?
Sure, I'd love to. And then I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, so I hope you don't mind broken records. But broken windows and broken records. So the broken windows came from a very, very famous piece published in The Atlantic that is worth a read. It's actually a fascinating sort of example of the genre of sociologists thinking about things and how it then becomes a movement. And the idea was, if you're in a neighborhood and a window gets broken, and nobody repairs the window, it starts to create a sense of disarray in the neighborhood. So maybe another window will be broken, and that won't be mended. And then people will start to throw trash on the street, and then all of a sudden, people don't feel safe. So whether in fact there's more crime or not, the sense of disarray makes people feel unsafe. They withdraw from the streets. Then, of course, the streets become more dangerous because there's not traffic on the streets. And the idea of the article was, so you have to rush in and fix the broken window right away. You can't let this sort of social disorder occur. And that became a theory of policing, which is the graffiti artists and the squeegee folks and the turnstile jumpers. We're just going to aggressively go after all of that so that we have a society that's not in disarray. And I didn't live in New York during the bad old days, but you run into lots of people who, I was just talking to some kids the other day who's, were reading something in school about how you couldn't walk through Union Square. And to me, that's extraordinary. My kids go through Union Square every day on the way to work. It's lots going on in the square I can't even imagine. And so there are many people who applauded that. But of course, broken windows came with an incredible cost over time, because even though there were drops of incarceration over the long run, as it kept going, there was an increase in incarceration and a lot of concern about whether that sort of policing was the right policing to do. Does it work? Here goes the broken record. We don't really know, because there's not nearly enough social science. So there are some conflicting studies. What some of the research seems to, there's been, I don't know why this is, but there's been more research about hotspot policing than pretty much anything else. And hotspot policing, or what's often called, Ron Davis always says, cops on the dots, which is where there's a problem going on. If you've got a drug market or something, then you flood it with police. And there is definitely a literature that shows that when you treat hotspots that way, it cools them down. And interestingly, you don't necessarily get the diffusion of crime. You might think, well, okay, if you hit the hotspot, it's just going to move down the street, but there's some literature that suggests that it doesn't. On broken windows, though, as with stop and frisk, there is not a literature to support that this made sense as a policing tactic. And it's undecided. We don't know. And until we do the kind of social science that we need, we're not going to know.
Jim, I'm going to ask you a little bit about dynamics within police departments. It's very clear that you're a reformer, you're interested in reform ideas. Anecdotally, my impression is when I talk to beat police officers, they're skeptics. When I talk to police chiefs and people in leadership, especially in big cities, they're more like you, they're reformers. And I thought this was just my impression, but the New York Times actually did an article about this back in February. So I don't think it's just an impression. I think there's something going on here. What happens when somebody moves from being a beat cop to going into leadership that changes their attitudes?
Well, I think there's probably an analogy here that anybody who has a child can understand. The older you get, the wiser your parents suddenly become, right? And I keep telling my kids this. I know you think I'm not such a bright guy, but when you start having kids and you get a little older, buddy, you're going to find out that I'm a pretty smart dude. And this happens in policing. The longer you're in policing, the more you realize that putting everybody in jail is actually not going to solve all these problems, right? And as you matriculate through your career, either you get more time on the job, or as you get more time, you also get promoted, because policing it has a connection to this idea of seniority. It takes, on average, about 20 years before somebody becomes a police chief. So along the way, you have learned a great deal about yourself, about the job, and about human behavior. And at some point, it kind of dawns on you that the stuff we used to do probably is not going to work anymore. And you just get wiser along the way. Also, there is just a dynamic that when you're a street cop, your whole world is your beat or those calls, and you are in the mix all the time. You have very little ability to think strategically about the direction of the department or policing overall. As a police chief or a sheriff, that is what you are expected to do. You're supposed to, like a corporate CEO, you're supposed to kind of figure out what the future looks like, where you ought to go, and head that way. There is an interesting movement, though, I will tell you about among street cops called the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, that is a group of very smart street cops who are using science to think differently about the tactics and the strategies they use. And the potential power of this is incredible, because these are a bunch of cops who have really got the message about using the best available science to advance policing, and they are communicating that belief to their peers. So you have a peer-to-peer network about doing better policing. Sometimes the verbiage we use with police officers can be an obstacle too. So police officers are more comfortable, I think, with the notion that we are advancing policing as opposed to reforming policing. Almost, in my view anyway, by definition, to reform policing means you're advancing it. It's evolving as part of that process. There are some nuances around reform that I think are important, but from a street cop's perspective, that, talking to them about, think about the job when you came on and 20 years ago, and what's it look like now? When I started, we didn't have PCs, we didn't have a computer system, there were certainly no cell phones or smartphones.
And you were riding that horse around everywhere.
Well, apparently they were dinosaurs. Actually, the young cops that used to ask me if I rode a dinosaur to work. And I've said to them, your job is going to look as different to you in 20 years as it does to me when I reflect back on my career. And you need to get ahead of this as soon as you can, get your head around it, and then manage that and think about where that's going. And I think we're starting to see some traction in this idea. Still, the average police officer is very focused on his or her personal safety, getting the job done, saving people, and leaving the strategic thinking for those folks in the head office.
Barry, I want to ask you about this observation I heard from, I'm pretty sure I got this from Glenn Lowry, who's an economist at Brown University. I think I heard him say this in a podcast. Thought it was fascinating. He's talking about the mixed messages that police officers will sometimes get from communities. And the way he phrased it was this: you could have a mother in a neighborhood who says, here's what I want from the police officers. I want them to get tough on the bad kids, and there are bad kids in my neighborhood. But I want them to understand that my kid is just being a knucklehead and, kind of exercise some understanding and compassion with him. The problem is that every mother in the neighborhood thinks that Their kid is the one exception. And so the police officers are actually simultaneously being told to get more aggressive and to be less aggressive. What do they do with these mixed signals?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that by actually piggybacking on what Jim said about, why life is so different or why the perspective is so different from chiefs than officers, and to tell a story that I think highlights direction for us. So, there's this very important idea of procedural justice. I think Tracy Mears is here, and Tracy and Tom Tyler have done terrific work. And the idea of procedural justice is that people will react differently and trust the police more if they're treated with respect and given voice. But what we often don't focus on in policing agencies is internal procedural justice, which is what is the relationship between the command staff and the line officers. And Jim's right that they're very focused on answering their calls for service and whatnot. But I learn more from talking to patrol officers than just about anybody I ever talk about. I'm including mayors, social scientists, police chiefs. They're out on the street and they know stuff. And we had this experience. We were in Los Angeles at the request of the police commission trying to help the community develop a policy on when to release body camera footage after an officer-involved shooting. And everywhere we go, we do community outreach and hear from the community how it wants to be policed, but we also ask the officers, and we make it a point of doing that. And we were in one session, and there was a guy talking. The minute he walked in the room, I thought he was a SWAT guy. It turned out that was true. It was a little confusing because he also was recommending a vegan restaurant to somebody, so much for my stereotypes. But he launched into this impassioned plea about, concerned about the release of the footage and what people would think. And in the middle of it, he stopped and he turned and he looked at us and he said, "I want to thank you for being here. I was in the US military for 10 years and never once did anybody ever ask me my opinion. And it means a great deal to me to get to say what I think." And I think, we need to listen to cops from the bottom up. We need to, as we've talked about a lot, get them out into the communities. Some kids are bad kids, some kids are good kids. How are the cops supposed to know if they're not in the communities and dealing with the communities? And give them the support that they need to understand that that's real policing. That going out into the community and talking to people rather than racing around and using force, but actually developing relationships, that's real policing. And they can get satisfaction out of doing that. They can get to know their communities. They can have voice in their own organizations because they learn things. I think that's how you make progress.
Jim, we can't leave the panel without talking about opioids. I just want to know if you think that there is a criminal justice and law enforcement solution to that problem, or if it's entirely a public health kind of issue.
So we know that the balanced and comprehensive crime control has three components to it, much like a tripod: prevention, intervention, and suppression strategies. As it relates to organized crime that bring opioids into the country, I think you have to suppress those folks. The cartels, serious bad guys who are polluting this country with this stuff, I think you have to use the suppression activities. And maybe even for distribution of that stuff, other people. But for the average person that's engaged with this, policing has to think very differently about it. First of all, it is more a public health issue than it is a criminal justice issue, by far, absolutely. But the police are the first responders in almost everything, whether it's a fire or a medical aid if they know about it or whatever, because of the way they operate, they're out in the field all the time. So I think if we want the police to engage people at that level, not only should they have their traditional policing equipment, they need to have naloxone, which is the stuff that you use when somebody's overdosed. They need to have tourniquets if people are bleeding. They need to have automatic external defibrillators in case somebody's having a heart attack. If they're going to be first responders, then they should be first responders across the board and save people's lives. Having said that, I also think that they should be first responders in terms of intervening in people. The police know frequently who's abusing drugs. And instead of saying, if I know you're a drug addict, Vikram, instead of trying to put handcuffs on you and take you to jail, I ought to have a conversation with you or your family and say, you've got a problem and we want to help you and we want to help you get into treatment. I think that when we do that, and there are groups that facilitate this now in the United States, there's 300 police agencies, for instance, that participate in a program called PARI, the Police Assisted Addiction and Recovery Initiative. And when the police start caring about you and your health to try to save you proactively, it changes the discussion and the dialogue about the purpose of police and what they really do in a community. And so I think there's a role for the police, but if we think the police are going to solve the opioid crisis in this country by themselves, we are going to be very disappointed by the outcomes.
Barry, we have about 30 seconds left. I don't want to leave without you describing the policing project, because you've referenced it here and there in many of your answers, but can you tell us what it is, what its goals are, what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure, I'm glad to have the opportunity. So the policing project is all about front-end accountability, and we deal with what we think are the 4 elements of front-end accountability. We help write rules and practices for policing agencies. We work on transparency issues. We help policing agencies get their manuals online. We write the policies in ways that the public can understand and interact with them. We do a great deal of community engagement. We're on the ground in Chicago and Camden and Tucson and Tampa and many jurisdictions I'm forgetting right now, actually trying out models of getting the community to have voice in policing, whether it's an advisory council or a police commission at the top or low-level community sort of neighborhood engagement with the department, but to give the community voice. And then finally, we do cost-benefit analysis. And in fact, we work on some of that with the Police Foundation. We're working on some cost-benefit projects together now and hoping to show that maybe we haven't evaluated the policing practices in the right way. So that's what we do, and thank you.
Of course. Well, that's our morning program. It's time for breakouts. Please give a big hand to our 2 guests, Jim and Barry. Thank you so much.